Jabber scribe?
I only put out one blue sheet. I mean, I do have another one up here, but this group is small enough. It seems a little overkill to have two of them. We're all going to put on one page here. Okay. All right. We are right on time here by my clock, and my clock is right because I'm sitting in the chair seat. This is the Registration Protocols Extensions Working Group. Welcome to everyone. I'm James Galvin, one of the co-chairs. Antoine Verschuren is up there in our Meet Echo, also participating along with a few other folks. And so the first thing is the mic on. There's no way for me to turn it on and off. Am I not close enough to it? That's much better, huh? Okay. Eat the microphone is the phrase. I have to make sure I stay close enough to it here. Okay. This is the standard note well. Please do take note here. Everyone should have seen this multiple times over in every meeting that you've been to here. But basically, the IETF owns you if you dare to speak or in any way contribute something. Document review request. This is just a generic slide that we like to put up just to remind people. This working group especially, we are a relatively small group. And we do struggle sometimes with making sure that we get reviews of documents and people to acknowledge that. It is important to even indicate a +1 when you support a document, or if you've got a comment, please make it. And of course, we're always looking for document shepherds. And you don't have to have any experience, but please do that. And in general, be kind to other working groups. Sometimes it's nice to have other people acknowledge your documents, and please do the same for other people in other groups. Okay, we have a very full agenda today. We have quite a bit of documents to go through and review. So this is really a good thing for us here. We've been quite productive here since the last IETF meeting and moving documents along and clearing milestones and such. And we'll get to talking about all of those details as we get through the day. Anybody want to jump in and offer a particular change to these major categories here for our agenda? And there's always a slot at the end for people to bring up anything new and extra that they want to add. So, okay, let's just jump right in here. Welcome and introductions. We do have a Jabber scribe. Thank you very much. And a note scribe. Thank you again. And we'll take a moment here to talk about our charter update. So very quickly, the charter remained with two items which have always been there since the beginning, which is that the responsibility of this working group is to deal with EPP and RDAP extensions that are proposed for the standards track. So this working group will get ownership of those. And most of the work that's coming in front of us seems to fall into that category. And of course, we started out way back when with a dozen or so documents that were on our list, and we're finally getting those cleared out of the way. It also turns out that we allowed for this mailing list for this working group and the working group in general to be the expert review location. I mean, it's an identified team of people led by Scott Hollenbeck for evaluating proposals for extensions that are not for the standards track, but they do want to get put onto the IDANA extensions registry. And we can use this group and this working group just to review those documents and for people to comment on them for those individuals. Certainly they're under no obligation to honor any comments and such, but the review is generally about making sure the document itself is self-consistent, and then it's allowed to be on the IANA registry. The big change that was important to this working group was to set ourselves up to be able to address some new documents, some new technical proposals that are needed in the ICANN context for registries and registrars for the use of EPP and RDAP. Historically, the technical work is done here in the IETF. ICANN focuses on policy considerations, and when there are policy considerations that have implementation choices, there's actually a technical operations group in ICANN that is working through some technical issues. And then the objective is to use the IETF process to be part of the IETF process, to bring those documents here. The IETF gets change control, of course, get broader review with a broader community, and move those documents into an appropriate publication stage, either standards track or perhaps informational, best current practice, whatever is appropriate, so that there's a technical documentation for it. We actually had to negotiate back and forth a couple times with the ISG to make sure that we scoped those suggestions in a proper way. There is a lot of concern about leaving the charter to be open-ended. We did our best here to try and keep that under control, and hopefully this accomplishes that, those 3 bullets there about what we can do. And we'll see some of these in the working group adoption in the list at the end. When we start talking about new documents, we now are set up to take on some of those new documents based on these bullets that are here. Any questions about our charter update? Okay, moving along. Document management is that sneaky little slide we stuck in the beginning before we got to the agenda. So let's move to existing document status. We're actually in a pretty good place here. We have 2 documents currently sitting in the RFC editor queue. I don't know that there's much to say there, except that the reviews are in progress and document editors are keeping up. But let me give the opportunity to document editors if you want to add something or say something more about these 2 documents. Allow people the microphone. And I have to keep an eye on this remote participation, see if anybody jumps in the queue there. Okay, going to move those past those fairly quickly here then. We have 4 documents in IESG evaluation. And I'm sorry, I misspoke before. RFC editor queue, that's really a final process kind of thing. That's really just the document editors working with the documents. The ISG review is where there are documents where the document editors are working through comments from the ISG and getting those documents ready to go. I believe Change Poll is in a really good place and is ready to go. The org drafts are sitting waiting for a new revision of those drafts to be published. The editors have taken on comments from the ISG, and they have to issue a new internet draft, a new version for the ISG to progress it. And the fee extension actually just had the new version of the internet draft published, I think it was Friday. Might have been a couple days before that, but in the recent past week here, we got the new version that the ISG was waiting for. So that's now available for that to move along and progress. So that takes care of quite a number of milestones that we had on our list. It's probably worth pointing out at this point that one of the things that happens is once a document is submitted for publication, we get to take it off our milestone list. So these documents don't currently appear on the milestone list, including the one on the RFC editor queue. And that's an important bit of formality and administrative characteristic just to notice for people about all these documents. So that's a good thing for us. Do those editors at all want to say anything about their documents? I'll allow folks a chance if you like. Yes, please go ahead. You can speak from the microphone there.
Yeah, I just want to bring up one topic that's actively being discussed on the list right now, and it was associated with, I'm sorry. This is Jim Gould from VeriSign. Apologize. Yeah, so one topic that came up was associated with the change poll, and it was associated with the scoping of the XML namespace. Now, the first time this came up was for the launch phase extension, And in essence, the feedback was sent off to the list to include EPP scoping in the XML namespaces. In the case of the launch phase, it was viewed as being too impactful to change the namespace at the last minute. The same thing held for the change poll as well. The main criteria is the fact that if you have production implementations of this, change the namespace will be impactful. So I would highly recommend that the editors and the implementers of these particular extensions speak up related to changes or impacts of XML namespaces. But I could speak for the change poll, and I knew that that would be impactful. So in general, I think we've been doing a good job related to starting to scope the XML namespaces going forward, but I wanted to bring this up for the working group to consider.
Thank you for that. Actually, that's a really good point. And as you said, I think we've been handling that and managing it, and not aware of any concerns within the ISG about it. It all seems to be under control. But going forward, we should be more careful, and we'll just let these that we have here go through as needed. We'll bring up the issue and make a deliberate decision about what we're doing. So, any other comments or questions from anyone about these set of documents here? Okay, then we'll move to the last one here. We have one document on our milestone list, which is waiting for the Shepherd write-up. There actually is, in fairness, there is a draft Shepherd write-up for this that exists, but it has not been posted yet because it needs to be reviewed. The chairs have to comment back to the relatively new document Shepherd about making some editorial changes to his document. It's in sort of his write-up is in sort of an odd format, and we want to clean that up before we submit it to the IESG for consideration. But it's actually ready to go, and so hopefully this document will be off our milestone list shortly. And you'll see that as we get to the end. And I'm looking, okay, I don't see the document Shepherd in our remote participation, so we'll just move on from there. Okay, moving right along. Let's jump to a discussion about the human rights review. I want to start first by making a comment here, which is kind of important. There's been some discussion on the mailing list about human rights reviews of our drafts, and there's been quite a bit of discussion about one draft in particular, some comments that were provided to us. I think that on one of the advice that we've gotten in having communicated with our area director, as a reminder to us, it's useful to keep in mind that these human rights reviews are really just individual contributions. And I think that's a really important point for people to keep in mind. There is no extra formality associated with the fact that there's an HRPC research group, which is looking at these issues, human rights issues, in a broader context. They are actively engaged as a group, and representatives of that group are going forward, with some documents and making some notes and making contributions to document editors about them. But I think that it's important for our own context and for the working group to keep in mind that we should treat them as we would any other individual contribution. With that in mind, I want to first let James Gould come up and talk about the document and the review that he received and what he did with that. And then we'll have any additional conversation from the working group about reviews in general and this particular document's review.
Thanks, Jim. So this is Jim Gould from VeriSign. In reviewing the feedback received, I did identify one applicable feedback that was important. One, and in particular, what this was that there was normative language in the extension that required the VSP to store the data that was verified. I agree that was a little bit of an overreach. What was absolutely necessary for the verification of code extension to work was that the VSP store proof of verification. It may store the data that was verified, but what was added to the security considerations section was that any data stored by the VSP must follow the applicable privacy laws and regulations. So in essence, the idea here is the fact that the verification code extension is simply a pointer and proof that verification was performed. Any collection of data, any storage of that data is up to the VSP, and there is no reason for the draft to imply a particular approach for storing that data. So that was the only relevant feedback that I could see that was incorporated in the draft. And with that, I will be requesting for a working group last call on this after we go through this discussion.
Please go ahead.
Gurshapat Grover, Center for Internet and Society. So I have a disagreement that it was not the only technical consideration from the review, in my opinion. And the obligation on the verification service provider to follow the privacy and data security guidelines is rather inconsequential. Like, drafts generally don't have advice, please follow laws, right? But in any case, I think there are some pending issues for the working group to consider. And I think the first one is what document status, intended document status, the RFC will have if this is published indeed. So, and to my understanding from RFC 3735, that largely depends on the number of use cases and how widely deployed this extension will be. And there was a discussion about this on the mailing list. And if this document has limited use, then RFC 3735 provides the option to document it separately and not as an RFC. Secondly, it says that it might have informational status, or it doesn't mention experimental, but maybe that, if it is not intended for wide deployment, but only for limited audience.
I'll make one comment, and I know that Scott will jump in on this, but no, this is generic. This is of general applicability. And actually in the last update, we included implementation status information into the draft. So you'll see the fact that there are multiple independent implementations of this particular draft. So from a process perspective, I'll let Scott jump in.
Scott Hollenbeck, and not really a process comment. I'm the author of that particular document, and I can speak to what the text actually says. It does describe the fact that extensions may be documented as either proposed standards or informational documents or not IETF documents at all, but nothing in there is a mandate to describe that one extension should be published one way or another, and there's no text in there that says anything about broad applicability means that thou shalt not be proposed standard. So this working group made a decision very early on that this document should be on the standards track, and to date I've seen nothing to suggest that we should deviate from that path.
I have no disagreement on how to interpret that clause. I would just like to quote it for the context of the working group. The intended maturity level, informational, proposed standards, etc., largely depends on what is being extended and the amount of general interest in that extension. I agree that it does not mandate any level for the document. It does not provide any prescriptions, but I would take the document as at least recommendatory in nature.
So yeah, the document is a standard track document, which is what it is. You brought up the question that you have some additional concerns. You believe there are additional technical concerns in the review that was provided that you believe were not addressed by James's revision to the document.
Yes, Mayor.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about what those are. Let's have that discussion.
Yeah.
Are there a lot of them? How many are there?
2 or 3.
Two or three? Which is
I would like to keep it as brief as possible.
Okay. All right.
I hope everyone has read the draft. And
yes.
So there is this grace period which is given to the VSP to reply with either the verification code or not. So the draft does not define the behavior when the VSP has not responded with the verification code in this grace period. So these details are actually not in the draft, but in the patent which is associated with the draft filed by VeriSign Inc. And I think this is important info which should be in the draft.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
The grace period is not associated with the VSP at all. The grace period is associated with the registry itself. So if the registry does not receive a particular type of verification code within a particular time frame, then it's up to server policy related to what action they take. Again, this is going into policy. The verification code draft will not try to imply or recommend a particular policy from the server. So in essence, I'm really careful related to separating policy from mechanics in the draft.
I understand what you're saying. I wanted to point it out as a scenario which is not meant, the resolution of which is not mentioned in the draft, which might be relevant to implementers.
Well, in this case, it's actually by design. We don't want the verification code extension to define a particular server policy. In essence, we're enabling the ability of verification code to be passed and allow for the server to define what those grace periods may be based on the verification code types that are supported. So in essence, it defines what the grace periods are within the draft. But again, when we get to actually defining what those grace periods and what the actions of the server will do if they expire, it's completely up to server policy.
So I have a question about that. I confess I actually don't remember for sure what's in the document here on this point, but does it actually say that the action is based on server policy?
We can re-review that and see whether or not the text is clear. But yeah, if it's not clear that it's up to server policy, we can certainly add some additional clarifying text.
I do think it's useful to make sure that that is a clear point. I mean, I appreciate the distinction that it's up to the registry to decide, but the text should actually say that it's up to the registry to decide, so it's clear.
Yeah, and if it's not there, I can go ahead and add that.
Okay, so I think this particular point could be taken to the list then. In my reading, this point is not mentioned at all in the draft, but only in the paper.
And can I request that you just add to the list any, maybe the two or three topics?
Yeah.
You include there in that way, I can go ahead and respond and make updates to the draft accordingly.
Yeah. Yes. The second one is the integrity of the object when it goes to the VSP and comes back. So I think the document should define that. So the integrity is maintained when it goes to the VSP, and the integrity of the verification code is maintained when it's back. But what the prescribed action should be that the object, the fields and data shouldn't be forwarded as received by the VSP, but actually should be matched with what was submitted by a registrant, let's say.
Oh, you're saying that the verification should match up with the registration or with the domain name. Is that correct?
Basically, we don't want a case where the VSP has sent in altered information, right? And that is used instead.
So you want to make sure that the code matches the registration itself. You're not using a code that doesn't match up. And that's up to the registrar to ensure that that is the case.
Yeah, the object data itself, I'm not talking about the
let's get a use case. Let's say that a domain needs to be verified for a particular domain name.
Yeah.
Right. And let's say that that domain name was verified and the code was generated, and that the registrar has the choice to include the code with the particular domain name, that they should match.
So
right,
when the VSP sends the verification code back, I want to make sure that the VSP has not altered information in the object that was sent to it. So when the received verification code and object is used.
I don't understand what are they altering? They're the ones generating the verification code.
Yes, I'm talking about the actual object, not the verification code. So the object will have, let's say if it's
which object are you referring to?
Host name or the domain object. Yeah.
Okay. Well, they don't. Not all verification will be associated with a domain name.
Yeah,
it could be a contact. It could be
exactly.
A host. It could be anything.
So there are 3 modes in the draft, right? I'm talking about any of the 3 modes. Whatever object is sent to the VSP, when it's received back with the verification code, that object should not have changed itself. I'm not sure whether the draft addresses this concern.
But again, that is a issue for the VSP. And again, we don't want to imply a particular way of collecting data and storing data and in the VSP. The verification code is
this is
generation
not,
of a code,
okay.
right?
I'm not suggesting an obligation on the VSP. I am suggesting an obligation on this body registrar itself, that it compare the initial request, which was received from a registrant, let's say, and then the object with the verification code, which is received from the VSP.
Who is doing this comparison?
Registrar.
Oh, the registrar. Well, in essence, what you're saying is that it's the registrar who is the active party, right? The registrant goes to the registrar. The registrar is interfacing with the VSP and with the registry. They are the ones that are coordinating this.
Yeah.
So in essence, if you're saying that the registrar should be the one to ensure that it matches up, it's their responsibility to do so, right? So it's in the language of the draft, it would be the client's responsibility to ensure that the verification code matches up with the object that is being created or updated in the registry.
Okay, so I will check whether this aspect is sufficiently clear in the draft.
Well, and like I said, bring it to the list, and maybe I'll understand it better as that if you write it down.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And the third thing which was suggested on the list is that the effects of implementing this should be as clear as they can be. And two different individuals have suggested that there should be a human rights consideration section in the document. And I don't know if the individuals are here, Adam Roach and Andrew Sullivan. They suggested on the list that a human rights consideration section to be added to the list so that anyone looking at the document or willing to implement it is made sufficiently clear of the human rights implications that are involved.
Well, let me respond to that. First off, that I have a concern related to mixing in policy again with the mechanics. So this is, if you're asking for, if policy and mechanics. So if you're asking for me as the document editor to put human rights considerations into the draft, that's moving into policy. This has to be mechanics. So if you have any recommended text to add, I request that
as there is a security considerations section normally in the document, it addresses concerns that arise out of the nature of the implementation, right? I don't think this is entering into a space of policy as you.
Well, I don't believe that there is a requirement to have that section in the draft.
Okay, so let me just jump in here a little bit to put this in a context. I think that I want to say two things. First, we've addressed what we know to be technical concerns with this document, right? So
except the 2-3 I pointed out.
Except for the item 3. Okay. So I think with that, if you can actually, if you want to sit down, you can. You don't have to go on. We can have a more general discussion about human rights sections in the document. I want to tease apart your item 3 into 2 parts, and that is I'm sure that what Andrew and Adam were suggesting is that if there is to be human rights sections, if there's to be human rights issues to be addressed, that there could be a section that held that. I'm fairly certain they were not saying that this document should have a human rights section in the document.
Adam Roach, quoting him now. I strongly support enumerating the concerns raised in the HRPC review as part of this document. Andrew Sullivan, I think it would be quite good for the document to note down that it has implications you are pointing.
Yes, and we've done that, and that's what.
Okay, James.
So we can now have a discussion in this group. I mean, I think as document editor, he took on board the points from the review that he thought were relevant. And now what you're bringing is you want to have a discussion about.
I was disagreeing with you about the nature of Adam's and Andrew's comments, and I don't think there is any human rights implication mentioned in the document, right?
Right. At this point, no. Yeah. It does not have a separate section.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get some other voices in the discussion here and see where we want to go. I think the important question here for the group as a whole to decide is whether these considerations are something that belong in the document or not. And that's for working group consensus. And in that spirit, Andrew and Adam are just speaking as individuals, but it is for the group as a whole to decide what they do or don't want to do with the document. So please, go ahead.
Hi, Niels ten Hoover, University of Amsterdam. I'm very happy we're actually having this discussion and that we're working on the draft, because this discussion has been going now, I think, for, well over a year, maybe 1.5 years. And when I first brought it up, James asked whether we could suggest text. Well, we've done the review, and we started the meeting as well with a request for reviews, and that's what we've done. So I'm very happy we're engaging in the process as it should be. I also really hope that different parts are taken into account. I think there is some mischaracterizations about how all points in the review have been addressed, and they can be addressed better. And I think there is space for that on the list. I do hope that we can actually, because that's how the discussion started, that we actually document that part of that discussion and the implications in the draft. And then it could actually make sense for us also to support publication of it, because then people would still have a choice. I think proposed standards going a bit far, but then you've shown the implementations there. Proposed standard might still go a bit far, but if the trade-off is you clearly enumerate the implications of that, then that would make sense. I think that's a fair balance we could live with. So it's also a game of give and take to build consensus, right? In which everyone is equally unhappy.
Okay, thank you.
Scott Hollenbeck. So Gershabad mentioned comparing this to security considerations sections. I'd like to draw one very significant distinction. We have documents representing IETF consensus that give us guidelines for writing security considerations sections, IANA considerations sections, internationalization considerations sections, etc. We have no such documentation that represents IETF consensus for documenting human rights protocol considerations. And as a document author myself, I would be somewhat at a loss for guidance on what kind of text is necessary and appropriate here. I don't know that this document should be the the test case for developing such text. I think I'd really like to see this conversation taken up at a level above this working group, so that we get a better sense of the IETF consensus on how and when and if this kind of text should be expected to be incorporated into documents in general.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Ulrich from IS. I think when we all sit at the plenum and then we hear this, the surveillance is an attack on the internet and the IETF is doing something against it and we protecting everything, we all applaud it. And now this is the point where where it comes down to, do we really do the work? Are we willing to, not just clap our hands, but when it comes down to it, do the work? And I think this is one of the points where we have to sit down and say, yeah, maybe we just document it. That might be even enough. So it's not that much that it asks of us to do, to come forward with this. It's not much, but it's a first step. And I don't see why we wouldn't do it.
Okay. Thank you. Before we move on and start the queue over again here, I do want to say that it is, you bring up an important point in wanting to reiterate or emphasize that some of the elements of the review, you believe that they do have a place in the document and that they should be covered and that they weren't. And I think that we're not going to be able to make that final decision here. That is something that we should bring to the list. I think, as James had suggested before, it would be good to separate what we know to be the technical issues that we talked about and it seems like we resolved, and then we can start a bit of a discussion about the items that you think should be incorporated into the document, and we're not at this point in time. And let's try and get that discussion going. It is for this working group to decide what does or doesn't get added. So the document editor gets first dibs at deciding, and if he incorporates things, that's great. If he doesn't, then we ultimately need to have a discussion here and for the working group to decide collectively that they agree that something should or should not be added. So we'll try to we'll let the queue run out here again, and then probably have to take this to the mailing list. I don't want to overtake too much time here, but we can take on the mailing list further discussion and seek some working group consensus on whether or not to add any remaining elements. But anyway, please go ahead.
Niels ten Hoover, University of Amsterdam. So it was my understanding that once a document is adopted by a working group, the changes, the right of change is held by the working group and not by the author, right? So first I want to reiterate as well that the implications of technology and understanding them is not policy. That's a separate thing. So I think we should not characterize the implications as policy work. Next to that, Scott made a great comment that security considerations are IETF consensus. Privacy considerations, however, aren't. And we find them in several RFCs as well, and are now a good community practice and have been standardized as such. There is there's
no documentation that describes guidance for writing human rights.
So
RFC 8280.
That is not what I'm describing.
Well, RFC 8280 has concrete guidelines on writing human rights considerations.
yes,
Maybe
but
I'll stand corrected once I read it.
Okay, great. But furthermore, if you want to discuss this, I really think that you should bring this up at the plenary and see if we could seek community consensus for integrating human rights considerations. I would be great supporter if you bring that up and having that discussion, because I think it's a discussion that should be had. Thank you.
you said 8280?
Yeah, 8280.
This is Jim Gould from VeriSign. I have read, I think, most of that RFC, and I got to tell you right now that I, as the document editor, is unqualified to provide any input into the draft that would match that particular RFC. So, yeah, I just want to second Scott's opinion on this, is the fact that it should be elevated up. I do not want the verification code draft to be a guinea pig for this particular activity. So I'm hoping that, so my point is that there's no other draft that has I'm sorry. There's no other draft that includes human rights considerations in it. I do not want verification code draft to be the first.
Okay, so, and I know that Jabberscribe, well, I'll let the Jabberscribe speak, and then I'll.
Sorry, this is just from from Antoine Verschuren. It was a while ago, but the discussion happened on item 3, so I let that go on first. On item 2, he wanted the clarification what the attack scenario was that they were trying to avoid. This was about the modification between the registry and the registrar.
So if you take that on board when you look in the Jabber, when you send your note to the mailing list about item 2, make sure to take on board his comment there from the Jabberscribe. Okay. So I think that it's important to understand that it is up to this working group to decide as a group whether or not to add any additional human rights considerations to this document. And I know that, James will honor whatever decision of the working group, comes to bear here. He's allowed to have his own opinion, which is that he doesn't want to add it, and that's fine. But I'm sure that if the working group decides they want it, that he would add it, and that would be the end of it. And go ahead, James, you want to comment on that?
Let me add as well the fact that I'm unqualified to provide that input. So if there was to be input, somebody else needs to provide it to me to put it in.
That's fine. So we take that comment, and
we're very happy to facilitate with that expertise and build that expertise together in this community.
Okay. Allow one more. Go ahead.
Just a very brief comment. I think that I have two opinions on that. The one is some language in the draft is definitely overreaching. Yeah, as we discussed before, like requiring storing personal information and so on and so forth. So, and on the other hand, I also understand that given all the sort of like obligatory consideration sections that we need to write when we write the draft, me as a draft writer myself, adding another one is like frustrating sometimes. Yeah.
Yes, well, the formality of having a required consideration section is certainly an IETF policy discussion, which is beyond the scope of this working group. This working group can focus on whether or not it believes that the issues being raised belong in this document or not. And then I do think that, you know, the folks bringing the issues to the floor here should also be the ones that bring it to the IETF plenary if they want to press on it being an IETF policy.
But just to very comment on that, but for the concrete text, I think requiring that a third party stores personally identifiable information would actually make the protocol probably unimplementable for parties without like 55 people legal department. Yeah.
Right. I think that part of the discussion that has to happen on the mailing list is not just about the bullet points of what should be in a human rights consideration, but actual proposed text that should be added so that the working group participants as a group can decide whether they like that. And I know that some of that has been proposed already and does exist, but maybe as part of starting one last thread as part of working group last call or in anticipation of it happening, just as we're going to do a couple of things here for technical discussion, let's start one clear thread, recapture that text and put it out there so that we can have that discussion for this document. Go ahead.
Would be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. The most important thing that I want to separate out in this discussion is the broader IETF policy discussion. That's a separate thing. It should be brought to IETF plenary or some other forum. HRPC, the research group, can have that discussion and in its relationship with the IESG and such about how to go forward with all of that. It is important that in this working group we only focus on whether or not, you know, the specific text being offered belongs in this document or not, if people are agreeable to that. Okay. Okay. And no one in the remote queue. Okay, so let's move on to our agenda here. New candidate documents for adopting. We have quite a long list here. There is currently 6 on this list, and we're going to take a few minutes to go through each of these documents. I believe we acknowledged on the mailing list and putting up the agenda that folks could have as much as 9 minutes for reviewing these things. I'm going to double check that calculation at the moment, but in the meantime, let's bring up Mario and let him do his 2 documents.
Jim, this is Roger Curran. Can you tell us what documents are currently being worked for the milestones? I know we want to keep it manageable. How many do we actually have now?
So that's part of the next discussion.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I am Mario Loffredo. I'm a researcher of National Research Council of Italy, but today I speak on behalf of .it registry. This presentation is about 2 add up drafts, namely sorting and paging and reverse search, that the authors consider mature enough, hopefully worthy of being adopted by the working group. Next, please.
Yeah, can I ask just for one thing? Let's split the discussion. So do one at a time, and when you get to the appropriate point in the slides, we'll pause and have that discussion and move on to the next one. Okay.
Okay. These are the current version of the 2 documents. The sorting and paging draft was submitted for the first time on May of last year, and the reverse search draft had its first submission on October of the last year too. Next, please. The basic concept that has inspired the first draft, that is also the main reason for the adoption, is well known. A search query in ADAP can return a larger result set that can be truncated due to server limits. But despite this fact, ADAP does not provide the user with any capability for restricting the results set in any way, returning the total number of objects found in order to evaluate the accuracy of the query, specifying the possible sort criteria in order to have the most relevant objects at the beginning of the result set and to avoid therefore the truncation of relevant results, and scrolling the result set when it is truncated. Next, please. Starting from the identification of those ADAP inefficiencies, the authors have defined 4 new parameters in the query string. Count, that allows the user to obtain a total number of results. Sort, that enable result sorting, and the limit and offset that together implement the result set pagination. In the last version of this document, new properties have been added to the standard response, namely sorting metadata that includes information about the current, about both the current and available sort criteria, and paging metadata that includes the total number of results and paging information. In the first version of this document, the document reported the use of an IANA registry dedicated to the specification of sorting properties, but we think that using metadata can contribute to make an ADAP service more self-descriptive and therefore more compliant with the recent trends in REST services. The introduction page metadata is due to the fact that we want to put pagination links in an appropriate section rather than using the links field in a common notice. According to which new property is included in the ADAP response, the server must add an appropriate value in the ADAP conformance array. And alternative to the offset pagination in version subsequent to the initial proposal, cursor-based pagination has been described. So a new query parameter has been defined. This new parameter is called cursor, and cursor is an open string representing a logical pointer to the first result of the next page. So this specification includes 2 different methods of pagination. Next, please. This slide shows the comparison between the 2 methods of pagination. The main advantages of offset is that it is natively supported by DBMSs, and it provides maximum flexibility in the usage. But it does not scale well for very large result set, and is not suitable for real-time data. However, this does not seem the case of registration data, because registration data are not very frequently updated. On the other hand, the cursor-based pagination scales well, but is difficult to implement. It's not flexible because you cannot select any portion of the result set. You have to scroll the result set from the beginning, and is not very compliant with the presence of a sort operator. For these reasons, it could be considered unpractical. And in this case, I think that an ADAP provider must wonder if it's really worth implementing this method. Next, please. This is an example of sorting metadata section, including the current sort, if any, and the possible list of alternate available sorting properties. Next. And these are two samples of the two methods of pagination. In the left side, the information provided in the case of offset-based pagination, and in the right side, the information provided in the case of cursor-based pagination. Next. So which is the best method to appear in possible ADAPT specification, or if the two methods can coexist in the same ADAPT implementation, we think that should be points of discussion within the working group. Another point of discussion is that if the describing metadata should be part of a more general metadata section, including other contents, for example, rate limits or information about the server and the response. Next, please.
Okay, before we get to reverse search. So one thing that I should have said, I apologize, when we started this section about working group documents, is the purpose of this discussion is not actually to resolve our issues. This is really about presenting the documents, get some clarity on whether you understand them. You know, do these questions make sense? Do you agree that these are valid questions? We don't actually have to answer them and solve them now, but if you want to make sure that you understand the questions, that's appropriate. And you know, if you do, and we'll go from there, because since these are not actually working group documents yet, the next step is going to be about talking about which documents to adopt. You might consider, if you, presuming everyone has, of course, you know, read these documents and you're prepared, if you have additional questions that you want to highlight and raise at this point, we can capture those in the minutes so that we'll have them, you know, as we go forward if these documents are going to progress. Okay. So with respect to pagination and sorting, any questions or comments about this document from anyone? Comments or questions about these questions? And I don't see anything in the remote queue.
Hopefully not about human rights.
Yes, well, we'll see. Okay, so with that then, we'll move on to the next document, which was Mario's, which is reverse search.
Yes. Now I'm going to talk about the second draft, is the reverse search draft. The reasons behind the submission of this draft are that reverse is a service that is provided by many web applications, but actually registry already perform reverse searches, because the registrar use usually out-of-band solution to obtain the list of domain names related to other registration objects like name servers or contacts. And in addition to them, there are some requirements coming from ICANN. In this slide, I have put two extracts from two documents suggesting some way the implementation of reverse search capability in modern registry directory services. Next, please. There are two main objections that have been raised in the past against the implementation of reverse searches. One is it can cause potential privacy risks, but ICANN itself points out that reverse search is allowed when is driven by some permissible purposes. It can be performed under controlled situations. And we all know that ADAPT relies on feature of other protocol layers to enforce security, so to to provide this controlled condition. There is another objection that is the impact on server processing, but we know that RDAP already supports searches, and the impact of reverse searches is absolutely comparable with that one due to standard searches. In addition, we can mitigate this impact by implementing other capabilities like sorting and paging, partial response, and filtering. Please.
Hello, this is Niels Troever from the University of Amsterdam. I would be very interested to understand whether you've sought to compare this to the GDPR, because ICANN is probably not the jurisdiction this falls under, but actually where the registrant is in. And I think this is like, on the first glance, this is quite a hefty breach.
Yeah.
I understand you're at an Italian university, so your ethical research board might also have something to say about it.
I know very well GDPR. Yes.
So it would be great to hear some comments on your analysis.
Yeah.
Actually, let me suggest that we not have a discussion about whether or not GDPR does or does not apply to this. We have a technical feature that we need, and whether or not this technical feature is used is a policy issue which will be decided by other forums and in other places. So, we're here just to talk about how to support searching when it is permitted, and it's not for us to decide when and where it's permitted.
With Niels Troever, University of Amsterdam, with this you're having a completely social deterministic understanding of technology. That technology does not say what is possible and what is impossible. But we do have, as engineers, an ethical responsibility to see what we enable or not enable. And I think we cannot simply say it's up to people who use it, because some things are forbidden in society, and also certain technologies should be standardized. And that is not a policy issue. That's also something we should think about as engineers. That's also in the ACM Code of Conduct. This is not a new revolutionary thinking. So,
fair point, and let me not belabor that discussion. We can have more discussion about that on the mailing list. So please go ahead.
Okay, next, please. So we had defined 4 new search segment paths. All of them have in common the reverse search pattern that is a JSON object including 2 members. The first member is called the value. It represents the search pattern to be matched by the corresponding entity property. It can be a string in the first 3 paths, and a JSON object in turn containing information about an EPP postal address for the 4th search pattern. The second member of the JSON object is called role, is a string whose possible values are those detailed in RFC 7483. Next, please. This slide shows 4 examples, one for each segment path described previously. And you can see how a query string can appear. Next, please. One final slide about the use of JSON in a query string. Firstly, I think that we should wonder if we can represent the reverse search pattern as a JSON object, and we must note that the entity role is a search parameter, is a part of the search. Reverse search is almost always executing by specifying an entity role. In addition, we must note as well that a compact notation would be recommendable when dealing with possible complex query. let us imagine to represent a query like that. Find domains whose registrants email matches blah blah as a string, and the text address matches blah 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 as a postal address. In this case, having a compact notation is better than having two separate parameters, one for the value and one for the role. If we are convinced that the reverse search pattern should be represented as an object, JSON is obviously the best candidate to pass objects in a string. Anyway, JSON contains some characters that are invalid in URL. There are, according to my opinion, three possible solutions. One is the URL encoding and decoding, that is the solution adopted by this specification. And URL encoding and decoding is performed natively by a web browser and is supported by library in various programming languages. Another solution, and it is a standard. Another solution is converting JSON to binary and to represent the binary data as an hexadecimal string. This is can be standard too, but binary data are not readable, are not human readable. The first solution is using a JSON variation that complies with URL specification, but neither of these methods are a standard. Next, please. This is the last slide. Is 2 points of discussion about the reverse search draft. If the reverse search should be based on other entity properties, different from email and format name and handle, and if reverse search should be extended to other objects, because we all know that entities are objects that are in relationship with any other object in ADAP. So we can have an object, an entity related to an end server or to an entity in turn itself. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments, clarifications, please? Go ahead.
Just one quick one. Rick Wilhelm, for the record. Can you flip back to the beginning slide about the policy, about the rationale? So this one here, in the middle, it says requirements from ICANN. Next-gen RDS PDP was terminated by ICANN because it's been largely overcome by events due to the expedited PDP. And so setting aside, so as far as motivation for doing something like this, I wouldn't lean it on what we've got here, because what's going on in and around search as it relates to RDS, registration data services, is likely to become changed, right? So this particular, the next-gen RDS PDP policy development process got shut down a couple of weeks ago after a long, and then things are up in the air with regard to the expedited policy development process. So that's a policy point, which is separate than the technical thing. But and so now setting that aside, RDAP is very early. So I wear taking that hat off, not my technical hat. RDAP is very early in the game. People are just getting started in their RDAP implementations. And I don't know if it's really wise for us to be starting to standardize this kind of stuff it's going beyond what RDAP really does when no one is using it in production in an anger yet. Additionally, there's people that are under contracts to provide RDAP services that are going to be bound by performance service and availability service level agreements. These kind of things will burden implementations for all implementers, and contracts are not frequently sophisticated enough to be able to parse out value-added things like this, like we're talking about here, searching, sorting, and all reverse search and all that stuff from the base level service, and it can make it difficult for implementers that have a contractual obligation to provide this stuff. And if you mess up an SLA, you can lose your contract, right? So,
I know that the first item of the ICANN requirements is in the past was published rather in the past, because it is about 4 years ago. But there is a recent document about registry agreement that is the second item, and that suggests the use, suggests the implementation of some kind of reverse search capability to satisfy some requirements coming from GTLD community. About the fact that especially in the case of reverse search, it can cause some potentially risks or it can be more or less compliant with GDPR. When we have thought about this capability, we were thinking to the requirements coming from .it registrars that requiring to the list of domains related to an entity, for example. So in our implementation, each registrar can search for his own domains, not the other domains. Okay, but this is a controlled way, a controlled solution. There are, I think that we can implement other controlled solution that can be provided. Other controlled accesses that can be provided to legal authority. I don't know if it can answer in some way to the doubts of the University of Netherlands guys. I don't know. But anyway, I am very convinced about the use of at least reverse search in a controlled way. Not that an authenticated user can search everything. Obviously, this is embedded in the proposal.
Okay, we'll take one more comment from the queue here, but I do want to be careful to not go too far down the path of trying to solve a problem or decide whether a solution is right or not. That's for discussion and work once we choose to adopt the document. I'll make one more comment building on what Rick said, but please go ahead first.
Eduardo Alvarez from ICANN. Technical part, I'm not, I can't really talk about GDPR or contracts, but I do agree that while RDAP implementations are at a very early stage, I think that this is partly because there isn't a specification or a formal way yet to do these kind of things, and I don't think it's going to happen unless we have at least the start of a standardization. So I think this is a good work that will hopefully push or make things go start moving. And also, aside from whether it's contracts or policy or whatever could be used as arguments or motivation for research, it's also important, I think, to consider that if this functionality is implemented for some registries right now in the WHOIS, which is expected to be replaced by RDAP, there should be some consideration as to how this new replacement protocol can fulfill the same task that WHOIS does, and of course in a standardized way, which is not what we have right now in WHOIS.
So thank you. So speaking as chair, let me build a little bit on what Rick said and what Eduardo there was adding to also. It is true that in a production way, RDAP for the use by registries, by domain registries, is relatively early days and new. And there's a lot of discussions going on about the rollout of RDAP in the ICANN arena where it belongs, because that's a policy consideration as to whether or not you have to do it or not. So I do want to just point out that it's clear with respect to this work that with searching, we're going to have a little dance that we're going to find ourselves doing repeatedly here, which is trying to separate ourselves from this notion of ICANN requirements versus what's needed here and what the work that we're trying to do. So I want to be careful not to motivate this work by ICANN requirements. To phrase this in a different way, certainly there are registries that have a need for being able to do searching in RDAP. And this is a carryover work item from when the RDAP protocol and specification was written. Searching was sort of cut off and not addressed in that base specification. So this work item has actually existed for a while. But we now have a motivation to resurface and resurrect this work item and actually make it come to closure, because there are domain registries that have this requirement that would like to solve this problem.
Yes.
And I think that that's fine. And so that's a reason for it to be in this working group, and that's a reason for us to talk about the issues that go with implementing searching. We will certainly be influenced by what ICANN is going to develop with respect to GTLDs. But it certainly does not have to be the determining factor in what we do. Given that this is early days, we have an opportunity to influence in the other direction, as we very well will do, because there is an RDAP pilot working group that's working in ICANN and looking at these kinds of issues too. So, you know, there'll be some back and forth here based on communities. There are people in both of those communities.
But,
so thank you for this, and I think this is a...
I would say that I'm not. I was not influenced by the ICANN requirements when I when I submitted the first proposal, because the proposal was before the ICANN requirements appear in the document. So I was influenced by the requirements coming from the .it registrars, but I think that there are common requirements of other registers and other, at least CCTLDs, but and then after a year, I have known that there are some requirements, similar requirements coming from GTLDs, but I was not influenced at all by ICANN requirements.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. I kind of need to move this along here. We're running way over, but so that's ideal. You know, this is a technical requirement, and we're going to treat it as a technical issue to be addressed. Okay, thank you very much. Next up, we will have James Gould, who has actually 3 documents to tell us about, not just 2. But I will put up these slides to start with, and I will let you sort out where we are with respect to the 2 documents that are going on here. So this is the slides here are for login security policy extension. The agenda slides are linked to the login security extension itself. And with that introduction, I will let you sort out for the working group and those listening what's going on.
Okay, so just not to get confused, I'll start off with the login security extension, which I introduced at the last IETF. In particular, that extension fixes one really important issue in EPP, is the fact that there's a 16-character password limit in the RFC. So this particular login security extension fixes that, allows for longer passwords. But while we were working on that, we decided to go ahead and include additional features that we thought were necessary as we were going through it. So that particular extension, I'm really hoping will be adopted by the working group. That's not to get confused with this particular extension. This was recently published, and you'll notice the pattern here. You take the extension, you add policy to it, and that is an extension of the registry mapping, which defines the server policies associated with implementing a particular extension. In this case, it's the login security extension. Next slide. So this is the first example of what we call a system level extension of the registry mapping. In particular, a login is not associated with a zone. A registry can support many TLDs or zones. In this case, it's talking about how the login works. And this particular policy extension defines the mays and the shoulds and the options that are defined within the login security extension. And I'll have to say that I highly encourage those authors of EPP extensions to go through the exercise of creating a policy extension. It's well worth the time. So, go to the next slide, please. So this is the policy information included in this extension. The first is the login password format. The decision here was to use a Perl-compatible regular expression to formally define the expected format of the password. It also includes an optional human-readable description of the password. The next policy element is support for the user agent. This user agent is an option that the client can pass that will help drive the server returning security events in the login response. But in essence, this will define whether or not the server will do anything with that optional attribute. And the last is defining the set of security events and the policies for each of those security events that may be returned back to the client in the login response. And in particular, it includes like the levels that will be supported, whether or not that particular security event has expiry, whether or not when it will start returning warnings, and what will happen in the event that a particular item expires. Will it fail a connection? Will it fail the login? Will it do nothing at all? And then there's one other set of policy information here. It's related to statistical security events. In essence, defining thresholds and periods for a stat event. Go to the next one. So I hope you can read this. Can you guys actually read that in the back? Probably not. But I'll try the best I can. In essence, what this shows is it shows the policy for the password itself. In this case, it shows a Perl compatible regular expression for the format of the password and a simple description for what that format says. Next slide. The next includes the Boolean for the user agent support, and then it starts going through the list of security events. The first is for the password. In this case, it's describing a password expiry policy. I'm not advocating for this in any way, shape, or form, but this is an example where a password would expire in 90 days. It would start warning the client 15 days ahead of expiry, and then it'll specify the fact that the login will fail if the password expires. Then the next item is for certificates. We're talking about the client certificates. In this case, what it'll do is it'll start warning the client that their client certificate will expire in 15 days, and that if the client certificate does in fact expire, the connection will fail because the TLS handshake will fail. Next slide. Here's an example of dealing with deprecating ciphers and TLS protocols. In this case, it'll return back whether or not a deprecated cipher or TLS protocol was negotiated. There's other options in here. In essence, a server could specify that that cipher will expire at a certain time frame. So this allows for us to get more secure and inform the clients when things are negotiated using these ciphers and TLS protocols. Next. This is an example, and this is completely fictitious, of the use of a stat security event. In this case, it can inform the client that there's been over a threshold number of failed logins, in this case within a day. Let's say that we got over 100 failed logins from a client. The server knows this. The server could inform the client about this, and they can set up a monitor to see what's going on. Then we also have a custom policy stat. Next. So in conclusion, this login security policy is the first system level registry mapping extension, and it provides the policies for implementing the login security extension. And in review, covers the login password format policy, support for the user agent, as well as the set of security events and the policies for each one of those. So I encourage you to review and provide feedback on this.
So I do have, as an individual,
I did actually have one thing. I'm actually not requesting for this particular extension to be adopted by the working group at this point. The registry mapping, we're still working on the IPR declaration. So the registry mapping, the launch phase policy, and the login security policy extensions will pending that particular item.
Okay, so thank you for that. So Jim Galvin, for the record, as an individual, the question I was going to ask is the dependency on registry mapping, and you just answered that question.
Yes.
And that's important to know when it comes time to decide to adopt the document. So this is a document which we will keep in our pending queue for adoption, but it won't actually come up for adoption when we get to having that discussion.
And I want to separate that from the login security extension, which has no issue with that.
Well, it also has a dependency on the. No, I guess it doesn't. It can be anywhere. Okay, yes. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anyone on this document? And I'm guessing there's not going to be any while I find my way to your other one here. Okay, let's move on to unhandled namespaces.
Okay, so this is, you can probably just go to the next slide. If you remember from the IETF last time, we had a working session on unhandled namespaces. And then out of that, what we came to agreement with is the fact that the server should not return extensions not in the client login services. So Martin Casanova and I took the action item to create a draft that provides a concrete proposal or approach to solve this problem. So the proposal is defined within the unhandled namespaces draft. And in this case, it chose to use the existing EXT value element in the EPPRC, and it includes the full unhandled XML within that element. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in review, the steps on negotiating the services include the server returning the list of services that it supports in the EPP greeting. And the client chooses the set of services that are intended to be used within that session. So out of that, the server should not return objects or extensions to the client that are not included in the EPP login services. So how do we solve this? Next. So with this, if you're familiar with the EXT value element, it includes two sub-elements. One is the value and the other is the reason. The value is marked as being unprocessed by the XML parser. So therefore, it'll be processed like a string. It will not look to validate in the case of a reference to an XML schema, and it will not do a DOM parse on it. So in this case, what will wind up happening is that the XML can be placed in there safely and treated as a string. And then the reason itself would include a pre-formatted description, including the namespace URI that is unhandled. I can take a question.
Alex here. I was just wondering what prevents us from simply putting the unhandled namespace XML elements into a CData section, or do you mean in which element we put it?
Well, in this case, the EPPRC already includes an element that would be better than the CData. Yeah. You can actually directly put it in there. Yeah. Okay. And I've implemented this. It's really easy to implement, believe me. The other element here is the fact that the full XML of the unhandled namespace can be moved into the EXT value element. So that includes both object level extensions as well as command response extensions. The net effect out of this is the fact that no information is going to be filtered. One of the concerns with what we had in discussion last time was the fact that the client would have to then go somewhere else to get the information that was filtered out. The other thing is the fact that it's RFC compliant. We're not returning any information that will be fully processed by the client. In essence, we're not going to break the client. The other thing is the fact that the client can process that information later. And probably the most important item is the fact that it addresses the poll message issue. We don't want to create a poison message in the poll queue, and we do not want to be returning poll messages that are not compliant with the RFC. Next. So here's an example. I hope that you can see this. On the left, yes, on the left is a object extension. So you see here it says namespace XML. All that happens is that it morphs the object response into a standard EPP response using the ext value element. So it puts the namespace XML under the value sub-element of the ext value, and then it has a pre-formatted reason. So the client can see this, can key off the reason, and then see what data was unhandled. Obviously, the client can go ahead and support that particular namespace and not have it moved to this location. But this is a way to go. Next. And here's an example. Let's say fictitiously that the client doesn't support the domain mapping, let's just say. So there's an example of putting the domain transfer data into the value element of the ext value with the pre-formatted reason. Okay. Next. Now, in the case of command response extensions, there can be many command response extensions. So anyone that is not supported will simply be moved from the extension block into the ext value element. You see here in the next slide is an example of the DNSSEC extension. So in essence, if the client did not support the DNSSEC extension, the server could choose not to return it, or in this case, it could return it and put it into an ext value element instead of not returning it at all. Next. One important item is the fact that this can be used in both general EPP responses as well as poll message EPP responses. In the case of general EPP responses, the server really has a choice here. The server could not return the information, or then decide to use the unhandled namespace approach to return the information. And really, this is only applicable to command response extensions, since in essence, if the server received a command for the object, you would assume that the client already supported the object, right? An example here would be the RGP RFC, if the client didn't support it. The other use cases for poll messages, the draft has a must in here. In essence, it pretty much says that when poll messages are inserted by the server, you don't know what services the client actually will support when they consume those messages. So in this scenario, using this approach, the client will be able to consume those messages safely. And so this would apply for both object level and command response extensions. An example here is the change poll extension, which was actually the trigger for this discussion in the first place. So next. So in conclusion, the unhandled namespaces draft maintains compliance, which is number one. It enables the information to be returned unfiltered. It allows for the poll messages to be consumed without creating a poison message scenario. And then allows for the client to go ahead and process that information later. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments regarding this? Please go ahead.
Yep. Ulrich from IIS. My understanding was that at the last IETF, most people actually thought of this as a not problem that we don't need to solve because we don't have it. So I don't see how we now get here with a draft for a problem we don't want to solve.
Well, we'll put it this way. Prior to that working session, there was a request to create a draft to be able to discuss originally. We didn't have a draft. We had a discussion. We came to the conclusion that the server should not return extensions that are not supported by the client. And then they said it was not important enough in general, but there was no consensus on that point. That's why Martin and I had the action item to go create a concrete approach for consideration. So this is an example.
I actually would argue that the poll message issue is kind of important. And even though I'm not a registrar in all of this, I certainly don't want to kill my registrars as a registry.
Okay, so at the registry, I can say that we have two kinds of registrars, those that poll and those that don't. Or we have a third kind that poll, but just throw away the messages. So yes, and those that poll, they will understand our messages, and those that don't poll, well, they don't poll, so they don't have the problem. And yep, we have actually done in the past not compatible backward compatible changes, and we haven't had any problems at all.
So well, you can probably say something.
Well,
similar,
what I wanted to say was that since we had the first draft come through that was associated with a poll message, meaning the change poll draft, and this issue came up, in essence, there was no good answer on how to solve that problem. I really didn't have a good answer, right? I was like, I don't know. I said, we need to solve this. I got to tell you right now, just simply returning the poll messages without considering what the client supports, you could certainly do that, but that's not what is the intent of the RFC.
Oh, this is still a wish. Yes, but this is basically a technical solution to a policy problem.
How do you consider this a policy problem?
Because we have actually contracts with our registrars that require them to support our EPP and to talk EPP to us and understand what we tell them over EPP and how they manage domain names over EPP. And basically the same that every GTLD has with ICANN, probably registrars have with their CCTLDs too. And so you're basically contractually required to understand that EPP. And well,
you could solve this through policy, and it's pretty nice that the registrars happen to support all of the poll message extensions that you happen to support, and I hope that you validate that they do that. But if there's a case where they don't, and they actually log in and don't support your extension, in essence, you're blindly ignoring it. So unless you are actively looking at what they are sending you with the login services, I don't believe you're going to be following the protocol.
So, yeah, Jim Galvin, just speaking as an individual, I think I'll offer Ulrich in response. I mean, sure, we have all of those same kinds of registrars. But the thing that occurs to me is, as a general registry service provider, not specific to any one, but we're not the only one around here who support a few hundred of these things. You get a lot of mixing and matching with registrars and registries, and bad things happen. And even if you were contractually obligated to support everything, there's just a lot of scenarios into which bad things can happen. And I think registries taking on the opportunity to be well behaved in as many circumstances as possible is a good thing. So at least for us, we would certainly support this kind of model.
Yeah, but this would be technically well behaved, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem that now the registrar has the information, but the registrar doesn't do anything with it because, they obviously didn't want the information in the first place or don't understand it. So we're just saying, yeah, we're giving you something technically, we're solving this problem but in the end, if you really want to do it, you need to solve the problem that you need to understand it. So we're not solving anything. We're just saying, yeah, we're making it look good.
We are actually solving something. What we're solving is that the registry is not killing the registrar. There's no poison message. And you're right, even if they ignore it and all of that, that's a good thing. But I'm not at risk of actually, causing them to be hit badly. And I think registries should be well behaved in that way. Okay, one last comment. We'll close the queue after.
Mario Alfredo from .it registry. I have just a technical doubt about how to parse the XML inside the X value.
Yes.
Do you represented the XML as it is?
Yeah, it just moves.
Yes.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, if you have a parser based on automatically built from the namespaces, your client should know the type of information it receives.
The point is that this solves a problem what the client does not understand, and by putting it under the value element, and since it's marked within the RFC XML schema to not process it, it will not go through to try to find the XML schema for it. I've already implemented this, and it processes like a string. It's beautiful. It's very easy to implement.
Yes, but to process after you had to know the.
Oh yeah. So, but you haven't lost.
Yeah.
You haven't lost the information. But certainly, if they receive it, they could write a processor to process it if they want to.
The only solution coming in my mind probably is the dirty solution, is to put the XML inside the AC data and deal with a string.
But it is treated as a string, right? I mean, in essence, it's a built-in C data within the RFC, so we can go ahead and leverage it safely.
It's a dirty solution.
Yeah, it'll work.
Okay, thank you, James. We'll do these next two here kind of quickly. The registry reporting repository, it's been casually mentioned in some of our meetings here. I'm just going to take on to speak about this particular document. This is a document which has been born out of the ICANN Technical Operations Group. It really just describes what a repository could look like, ideally should look like on the registry side, so that registrars can easily get and quickly get access to various kinds of reports that registries are obligated to provide to them as part of the GTLD space in ICANN. It really is a fairly straightforward document and very straightforward request. And the idea is it just provides the SFTP, what that should look like and the path to go down. So it's a proposal for a document for us to add. And comments or questions?
Yeah, this is Jim Gould from VeriSign. Actually, I've reviewed this and I reviewed the other report drafts, and I kind of have a concern on these ones. I'm not sure if this has worked for this working group. They seem very specific to directory structures and file names and that sort of thing. I think what would be more applicable for this group would be like a report definition language mechanism that is more generic, that would allow and support any sort of report. I'm not sure whether or not this working group would want to bring up how to format a particular report. But in essence, the way I look at it is like data escrow. You look at the data escrow drafts, they define a mechanism to define a data escrow, and it does not define the specifics of any one data escrow.
Okay, so that's a consideration to have on the working list and talking about it. That's good.
Alex Mayo for Nick.at. Quite frankly, I don't find that work in our charter.
In the new charter, there is one of those final bullet items is about, I'll go back up actually to the slide here that has this.
Maybe I missed it, but. I mean, if that's the wildcard item for all kind of data definitions around all kind of registry operations, then fine. But then we need like 40 more people. Yeah.
Well, that's a fair point.
Where are the registrars? Yeah.
Fair enough. You can certainly raise the question of whether or not it really is something that's appropriate here. Yeah. And all of the work that's in front of this working group often has the issue that we're a fairly small set of people that are looking at these things. And I don't have a good answer for that. But you can certainly raise that on the mailing list too, and we'll see what kind of discussion we get out of all of that. I'm fine with that. I think
it's a pretty old discussion. There are people like I understand what they are trying to achieve, and they sort of wanted their document crowned, by taking our RC number onto it. Yeah, I believe that there must be other ways within ICANN CPH TechOps or whatever to agree on things that are not necessarily need to go through the full IETF process. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
That would be good. I think, you know, those particular ideas and issues, and as a challenge, if you will, to the document, I think you should absolutely bring that up on the list when we get there. And don't fall down, Rick. We need you.
Sorry, my fault. I always compare it. The airline industry and the travel industry doesn't standardize their booking KPIs in the IETF. Yeah. So.
Well, yes, and one might question whether or not that's a good thing, but nonetheless, Rick, go ahead.
So I have a slightly different point on that document, is that and I need to bring this, and admittedly, I haven't gotten this comment to CPH Tech Ops yet, but that document on reporting it nails us, it specifies that it's using SFTP, which we don't, at least at our company, we're not big fans of. And so we're like sideways with that straight out of the gate. So when it seems odd to anchor something like that in SFTP, but that's just me.
No, fair enough. Good point to bring up. And Roger, you want to comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Roger. And I think this is a good discussion that we're having. And I like Jim's idea of maybe a definition versus specifics. But I mean, this all started out of the fact that registrars wanted to, well, at least one registrar wanted to get things in a more predictable way instead of, 10 years ago, it was easy to negotiate with 8 people to get something that looks similar. Now it's 200 registries that we have to work with to get something similar, and it's a lot more difficult now. And it was interesting because our first response was, hey, okay, we want this in this format, and the registries returned and said, well, we've got 200 other registrars requesting it in a slightly different format, so can't you agree on something? So that's where the whole standard process came in, was like, okay, both sides were saying, yeah, it needs something to happen. So, where does that happen at? But yes, I agree that some of the technical or some of the little pieces here can be refined. And to Jim's point, maybe it makes sense to come up with a definition, not necessarily a specific thing. So definitely something to look at. Thanks.
So this work item is at least a concept for the moment, and we have a starting point to talk about that concept. And if we adopt it, then we'll dig into the details. Okay. One last one then, which is the registry mapping. And no slides here either for that, but go ahead, Roger.
No, it's Roger. We'll make this quick so we can move on to other things. Because Jim kind of hit on this a little bit earlier. This is ongoing work, actually. A lot of work's going on right now with it. Not within the working group. Some of the members of the working group are doing it. There's the IPR issue that Jim mentioned earlier. It needs to get solved before we really feel comfortable about trying to bring it into a group and getting it work. So, again, I encourage everybody to go look at this. It is something that's moving along fairly quickly. So, anybody that needs the information can ask Jim or myself, and we can get more details to you. I don't think we need to cover that right now. So,
should just remind folks, there have actually been several interim meetings during which this design team, if you will, has been meeting and talking about registry mapping. So there's been plenty of opportunity to dig in and look at some of the details here, separate from the IPR issue that we're trying to deal with. So, please take note and feel free to jump in and continue to participate.
Yeah, and this Roger again, and thanks for bringing that up, Jim, because I know I owe Jim and Anton notes from our last interim meeting, and I'll get those out as soon as I can. But one of the other topics that didn't show up here was the validate, and I just wanted to bring that up again.
Coming up next.
Okay, for people to remember that. So, thank you.
Okay. So that leaves us with a little over 15 minutes for what we had set aside or intended to set aside, about 10 minutes to talk about working group adoption and our milestone review and discussion. So let me kind of set up the discussion here. I had sent a note to the mailing list a little bit. For reference, there are currently 3 milestones left on our milestone list. Given that we have progressed, especially in the last 9 months, we've done just an absolutely stellar job of finally coming to closure on a number of documents that have been hanging on for a while. The two that are listed here in boldface, an informational document for third-party DNS providers, and the validate mapping, which is what Roger had just mentioned for the extensible provisioning protocol. Those two really are the ones that are left. The bottom one there is left in italics because the bundling registration, as I had reported earlier, we have a shepherd write-up for that. And so it is very soon it will be submitted to the ISG for publication. So we are left with just those 2 milestones currently on our list. And we have to make a decision about what we're going to do with those. Okay. Now, one of the things that I had done on the mailing list was what Antoine and I have done is kind of go back, and we've been thinking about our process a little bit here and what we've done and how this working group started, and also in consultation with our area director about what our options might be. So we're kind of making a specific proposal to the working group, and this is for discussion. And so this period right now is for discussion of this issue. When this working group started, we had something over a dozen documents that we sort of automatically adopted and inherited right away, and chose to progress. And it's kind of been a tough slog for us to move those documents along. Other working groups in the IETF that tend to have a lot of things that come and go. DNSOP is always my personal favorite, but there are other working groups that have things that happen. They also have for themselves a bit of process and some policy for themselves about how many milestones that they really take on, how many documents do you adopt at a time, and otherwise you just sort of keep them out there in a pending state waiting for an opportunity to slot them in. We're a relatively small group. There's a small number of us that tend to focus on really contributing the most to moving all the documents along, with a couple other people coming in and out at different times on different documents. And that's okay. We can work with that model, but it does say that we don't want to be in a situation where we're taking on 10 or more documents at a time. And what the chairs had offered up as a proposal was to pick a nice round number like 5 and just say that we should never have more than 5 documents that are actively being progressed in this working group at a time. So with that in mind, if you think back to the fact that we have 2 left here, that essentially means we have 3 open slots if 5 is the number. So a first question for us to talk about is whether or not 5 is the right number of open milestones for this group. And I will tell you right up front that if we try to make it more than 5 at a time, we're probably going to get pushback from our area director. Seems fairly confident that we've had enough trouble trying to get the 14 original ones or so down the road that we're going to need to have a pretty good argument for taking on more than 5. And I think there's actually even a desire to make it smaller than that. But I think we've got 5 as a good starting number. But it is open for discussion nonetheless. A second question, of course, is as I was looking at those 2 milestones that are up there, it does beg the question of whether those things are actually going to come to closure or not. The validate document has really had no real discussion or progress in quite a long time, although Roger did just bring it up. So, maybe it is something we do want to latch onto now and move along. The DNS operator document is kind of interesting. It has sort of come and gone over the years that this working group, and even previously the EPP working group under which it started, that document existed. The document editors have had their own personal issues and they've kind of come and gone, but it's not clear what the status of that document is and whether or not it's even something that could progress. So I actually do believe that it's fair for this working group to consider if it wants to remove that document from our open action list. And that's a discussion we will have to take to the mailing list because none of the document editors, I don't think, authors of that document are currently in the room. So I certainly wouldn't want to make a decision about that without bringing it to the list and giving them a chance to voice their opinions about it. And of the, this actually says 8 only because it said 8 in the original mailing list message, and I forgot to edit out the 8 to say 6, because that's what we actually presented. Actually, it was 7, I think, because if we have login, security, and policy, it's 7 documents. But in any case, a critical question, whatever number we choose with the answer to question 1, a critical question then is going to become, well, since we have 7 to choose from, which 7 get to fill the 3 open slots, or 4 if we decide not to keep the other document. So the way in which I would suggest that we'll do this on the mailing list, we'll come up with some way to give everyone a chance to vote for their document or to submit an ordered list of their preferred documents to advance, and then the chairs will collate that and create a summary and put that back onto the mailing list for yet one more cycle with the working group, in case people want to change their mind based on what comes out of that. I do want to make sure that we give all opportunity for voices to be heard about documents and not try to rush it too quickly. But it is an important consideration. How many should we have? And then given that it's not going to be all 7 all at the same time, how are we going to select which ones? And so this is an opportunity for some open discussion about this process, any comments that you have, any answers you have for these questions. So please go ahead, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on the Meet Echo queue and slot you guys in with whoever stands up at the mic here.
Thanks, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck. I do have some concerns about a fixed number. Right? Inevitably, something else pops up that's important, right? And okay, and I've got my own selfish reason and selfish concern for bringing this up. I've got an internet draft out there that describes a federated authentication approach for RDAP that I have not brought to the working group for adoption yet, because ICANN still doesn't have his policy act together. And I don't want to be, coming up with protocol for policy that is TBD, because I don't know if I can meet those requirements. But let's just imagine that we live in some fantasy world and eventually ICANN gets its policy act together. Well, the next thing I'm going to want to do is bring that document to the working group and say, hey, would you please consider this? And if we have a limit of 5 and we're already at 5 and I've got a backlog of 5 more, that document may end up sitting for quite some time. So I guess I'm okay with a limit as long as we do have some recognition of there may be a need for an exception process. And whatever those exceptional considerations may be that the working group would consider expanding beyond 5, if a case can be made for the need to take on 1 or 2 more or whatever.
Thank you.
This Roger, similar, but not quite the same. I think that the number's a good goal to keep in mind. Some documents will seem like there's a lot of work on them and it'll take a lot of effort. So again, I'm not sure that 5 as a static number makes sense. As a goal, to me, it makes sense. And actually, I think it probably is closer to 4 with the amount of people that actually do the work on the list. 4 is a lot of work for each person that's actually doing work. So I would suggest 4 as a goal. But to Scott's point, yes, we need to be able to examine and prioritize and get things on and off the list if needed. So as far as which ones of the 2 current ones, I would tend to agree that the DNS seems to have fallen off. I'd like to hear from some of the authors, current authors. I know that they were in discussions of using other options, so but it would be good to hear from them and see if it's needed. The validate, I would like to get pushed through. We do have a couple people that have started implementations on them, so I would like to continue that and finish it through for those people. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Cal Fayer. I've got a comment here from Antoine. At Scott, why does your standard depend on ICANN? And just personally, I support Roger's comment actually on the limit, so long as it's not a straitjacket, I guess.
So Scott Hollenbeck, to answer Antoine's question. Antoine, right now the document includes certain attributes that are associated with identities, and whether or not that list is complete is the open question at this point. So it's more a matter of efficiency than anything else. we could bring the document forward right now, for example, but we may find out in 6 months that ICANN comes up with another requirement for an attribute to be associated with an identity, and we'd have a choice to make between bringing it into my document or some other document that touches on that topic.
This is Jim Gould from VeriSign. Yeah, I second the fixed, or I guess third, the fixed limit is the fact that there are different drafts have a different amount of work associated with them. If you consider like the launch phase draft that eventually became RFC and registry fee, those require a lot of work. And so some of these may not be that controversial and may be pretty easy to push through. But some of the other ones will take a lot of work. I think like registry mapping in particular would be a lot of work.
Thank you.
This is Roger again. I would encourage Scott to actually push that draft forward. And I understand his concerns about it. And I think that the only reason I'm saying it is it'll take time for that draft to get through. And I think that we can add those few things if they pop up. So thank you.
So I'm not seeing anyone in the Meet Echo queue. Let me just offer some observations, I guess, speaking as chair about all of this, and I haven't coordinated this with Antoine in particular. I do understand the need for an exception process, and I would think that our area director would be sensitive to that. You know, I mean, if we could make a good case, then, you know, we could certainly deal with issues that come up. The only observation that I would make in this space is I think that if we are actively working on whatever number of documents it is, and we're going to take on another one, that's an interesting thing for us to be thinking about. I mean, as Roger was just saying, there's a limited number of us anyway. It just feels like odds are something's going to get swapped out if we're going to try to swap something in. So, you know, maybe the exception situation is you don't necessarily put something you don't take it off of the active list, but you recognize as an operational action that it's going to fall to the lower list, fall lower in priority, and you're going to focus on something new that you want to add. And then the concern is going to be, I'm sure, with our area director, that we manage the number of exceptions that we add that come along before we actually unload something. We have to be a little more deliberate about unloading something. You can't just park it, you know, and know that you're parking it. We're going to have to make this dance. And even with respect to OpenID, I understand Scott's hesitation, but the interesting observation I make is that for those of us who really do care about that, we're already in both communities and we're doing it in both places anyway. So, you know, putting it here, we know what's changing and what's not changing. The benefit of bringing it to the IETF is getting broader review and broader interest and acknowledgement of what's going on. And I think that'll help us on the other side in the RDAP pilot working group. So I think I would support Roger's comment to you, Scott, that maybe, you know, putting it on the list of potential things to adopt is a good thing. I think our potential things to adopt list is growing here already. So there's that. And I was also thinking about, we only did the reporting repo document here, but there's another reporting document out there that probably ought to be brought here. And there's the data escrow documents, which are not on the list here, but they've been kind of pending for a while too. So we have a number of documents that are kind of important. They are important because, you know, the ICANN community is going through a transition on the GTLD side. And so there are a number of open issues that are really a work in progress, number of balls in the air. So we may find some things coming here that we really want to get broader review on. And we're going to have to manage our milestone list. So what else do I want to say here? I think that we'll probably try one more time to open this discussion and press on it on the mailing list and see what folks said. I actually like Roger's suggestion about going down to 4. I think making it 4 is probably the right number, especially if we have the option for an exception list and the ability to add things. I think, you know, sort of 5 is sort of what I had in my mind, but if we make it 4 as sort of the real action ones, that actually does give us a slot, if you will, for an exception case. That's a little bit easier to deal with than saying we have 5 open ones and 6 becomes the exception case. And that just feels a little better to me. That's just my personal view. Jim,
Yes, Jim Gould from VeriSign. Yeah, I don't have a comment on the number, say, but I was trying to ask, what is the action item? Are you going to post an action item for, you know, the ones proposing to put their priority order and that sort of thing in place?
Yeah, so there's two actions that come out of this. One action is to just press on this discussion on the mailing list. We had published these 3 questions on the mailing list a couple of weeks ago. There were only 2 messages, I think, that went to the list about it. So I want to press on that again. But I suspect that there won't be too much discussion, and then we'll quickly decide on a number. Unless anyone wants to object strongly, I think I'm, as chair, going to push on 4. So that's one action. A second action is to press on the DNS operator folks to whether or not they are actually going to progress their document or not. They're past their milestone date. It has sort of been languishing on and off. So we'll press on that to see if we have 4 slots available, or, well, 3 slots available, or 2 on our list. Then the third action will be for the chairs to make a consolidated list of all the documents that are available and eligible for adoption. And then we'll first do a little iteration to make sure we've got them all. And then we will conduct some kind of voting mechanism. So a fourth action for the minute taker there, who doesn't look like he's looking at me, but I'm wondering what you're doing. So the fourth action, did you get the first 3?
He was taking really good notes, and then kind of
He got real thoughtful. Action 1 is to restart the questions to the working group. Action 2 is to reach out on the list to the DNS operator folks. Action 3 will be to create a consolidated list of documents that are eligible for adoption so that we're clear on what we're looking at, a complete set. And then action 4 coming out of this will be to actually conduct a vote of some sort. We'll conduct some kind of consensus poll on how to choose those documents.
Check the list of DNS operator folks regarding that one, regarding
the 1 milestone. No, they're either going to progress the documents or they're not. And if they're not, we're going to take it off the milestone list. So we're going to have to force that decision. And I think that closes the milestone discussion and review. I'll just look for a nod from our area director. Are you okay with all that? Yeah, okay.
Adam Roach, as area director, I just wanted to point out, I do very much like the formulation of having like a goal and a limit as separate considerations. So that feels right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Good. That brings us right up to like 60 seconds left for any other business. This is perfect. Opportunity for anything.
Scott Hollenbeck, just a quick reminder, I sent a note off to the list earlier. We're going to be having a registration operations workshop in conjunction with ICANN's GDD Summit. Interestingly enough, right back here in Bangkok. I think it's in May. So if you are going to be at the GDD Summit and you're looking for some interesting things to talk about with respect to this from an operational perspective, please plan on being there. Please consider developing a presentation proposal.
Thank you. Thank you. Good opportunity to point that out to folks. Okay. Anything else from anyone? I will waive the 1 blue sheet that I had passed around before in case anybody wants to come up and sign it if you didn't. And with that, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.